a LitHub Radio podcast.
Hello, wayfinders, elders, alchemists, and torchbearers. I'm Brooke Warner here with Grant Faulkner, the best co-host I could have asked for in all these years.
Thank you, Brooke.
It's true, Grant. Yeah, I mean, years of conversation, and we're still here. You know, we talk to people so much on this show about their memoirs and personal writing, and we get so much insight into this one thing that all personal writing showcases one way or another, and that is hard-won wisdom. And I don't think anyone dares to write a memoir without that, actually. And today's guest, Sari Botton, packs a lot of that kind of wisdom into the pages of her memoir, which is called And You May Find Yourself, Confessions of a Late Blooming Gen X Weirdo. I love that title.
Yeah.
And Grant, you recently turned 60.
Should I do a woohoo for that too?
I know, I was pausing for it.
Woohoo! Happy birthday.
You were featured on Oldster, which is an online magazine run and published on Substack by our guest today. And I'm curious to know if you're cognizant of your own hard-won wisdom, and if you felt that in the feature that Sari was encouraging you to share some of that with her readers.
I think the hard-won wisdom of age is how little you know about life, perhaps.
Here, but not here.
Yeah. But I was just immensely honored and flattered to be featured in Oldster, and I love the magazine in part because of its ethos, which is we're all oldsters because we're all getting old, you know. So it levels the playing field by making aging this common subject for reflection, and I also love how Oldster mirrors the word hipster. So I think Sari's making getting old cool, which is much overdue. And that's what I'd love to do. You know, we live in a culture where we're taught to hide our age and be ashamed of it, you know, when the opposite should be the case, which is, you know, one reason I wanted to publicly proclaim my age and celebrate it, you know, because if you think about it, we often say things like, oh, you look good for 60, or you look good for 70 or 50, or we say, I'm going to date myself, you know, as a preface to recounting a past experience from a long time ago. But both of those statements, you know, kind of are inherently ageist. But to answer your question, yes, you know, I feel much wiser than I did 10 years ago and much wiser than I did even a year ago. And I think that is one of the great benefits of aging. You know, you actually feel more confident in your wisdom. And, you know, I mentioned this, but one thing that bugs me about our society is how we neglect this vast and deep resource of older people's wisdom because we live in a youth culture, you know, which really goes against the grain of so many other cultures in the world, which focus more on, you know, celebrating and revering the wisdom of elders. So, Brooke, do you read Oldster yourself?
Sometimes I'm subscribed. You know, I read it when I can. Mostly I read the ones when I know the person who contributes. And I've actually known a fair number of people who have been profiled. So I especially love to read those ones or people I'm loosely connected to in a professional capacity, obviously, because we're in this writing world that we're in. I admire her effort, though, very much because of this whole thing that you're saying, like shining a positive light on aging and getting older. And I know that Sari approaches her work from a very feminist lens. And in fact, Sari and I know each other because she published at Seal many years ago, and we were reminiscing today. It was 2012. So it was right before I left. I left Seal in 2012. And so that might have been the last book that I acquired before I left. And I do appreciate her feminist lens. And what I mean by that when I say that is that a person who approaches their writing in a way that really honors authenticity, and especially that rebukes the idea that women need to fit into a particular mold in order to be desirable. And I think this is one of the reasons that feminists find the current administration so deeply anti-feminist, is because the expectations on women by this leadership in particular, you know, expects women to conform to a societal ideal, which is usually mother, beautiful, feminine, and that's not representative of all women. And I think what Sari's work really does broadly is to push back on the notion that we have to be any which way in life. And I'm very aligned with this message from her, call it an orientation, because we get very, very squeezed when we feel that pressure, you know, that kind of expectation, and then we can't or we don't measure up. And Grant, so I'm curious, because you are a straight white male, do you feel these same social pressures? And if you have, where and when have they shown up in your life?
I don't feel societal pressures in the ways that conservatives have put them forth as men, you know, and I've always been a bit on the margins of that manly manhood, you know, which is perhaps because I'm more inclined to the arts and around writers and other artists, and I actually just generally like women a lot more than men. And it's interesting though, because I feel things like the beauty standard more as I get older and less beautiful. But I also know that as a man, I'm just feeling a tiny smidgen of what women feel. And when you asked if I feel wiser as I get older, one key area I'm getting wiser in is the number of privileges I've had as a straight white man. That I've been, somewhat oblivious of. I think there's just so much to kind of unearth and uncover. For example, just yesterday, a friend was telling me about how a group of her women friends were sharing stories about how they'd avoided, creepy or threatening men on their jogs, especially when they ran alone. And I thought about how rarely I've actually had to do that or even think about it. I just jog pretty much where I want to, and I jog alone and never really, like I said, I just don't really think about it too much. So I don't think I feel the societal pressure of measuring up in some key, manly areas, like being good with a hammer around the house, as many people tell you. But I do feel pressure to be more aware of what it means to be a straight white male. And, there are just so many deeply embedded privileges to reckon with especially as our current administration, is putting on display. I mean, I'm just completely horrified by this huge step backwards we're taking. And I think a lot of it is due to fragile masculinity and a very explicit and unapologetic desire to return to a more sexist society. So I never thought we'd take such a step backwards and such a huge step, and as a man, I'm completely embarrassed by it. And it's just going to be horrible to deal with for years. But I do believe in the power of stories to guide us through dark times. And I know you brought some of those stories into the world at Seal Press, and that Goodbye to All That, Sari's anthology with Seal Press was a breakout book in terms of being an anthology. A lot of people want to edit anthologies, and I know they're famously hard to place with publishers. So what made this one so successful?
It was the whole package, honestly. I mean, it was an incredibly smart concept, the idea of loving and leaving New York City. I think people are so fiercely attached to Manhattan, especially, and New York more broadly. People love New York so hard, but it also chews you up and spits you out. And people often grapple with how they can stay, whether it's about affordability or pace or just reaching a point in their lives when it's time to move on. And then there's also the contributors. And Sari just said to me before the interview that there were 7 new contributors to the revised version, but some of the ones in the current version are Roxane Gay, Leslie Jameson, Danny Shapiro, Cheryl Strayed, Emma Straub, and Ada Limon. I'm not sure if it's Ada Limon or Ada Limon, but that is an all-star lineup. And so that is, part of it as well, for sure. When it comes to anthologies, the bigger the names, the more successful the anthology.
It's just a wonderful anthology, and the title comes from a Joan Didion essay that's cited in the front of the book that reads, "All I mean is that I was very young in New York, and that at some point the golden rhythm was broken, and I'm not that young anymore." And that's just so resonant, and it seems to point to Sari's recent focus on aging and how our ideas and ideals change. And you and I, Brooke, we were both very fortunately young in San Francisco, but not New York. But I felt the same way about San Francisco, certainly. So I was super honored to be asked to write an essay about my early days in the 90s for an anthology that mirrored the New York version. It was called The End of the Golden Gate, Writers on Loving and Leaving San Francisco, and it was published by Chronicle Books. And beyond me, it featured writers like Margaret Cho and W. Kamau Bell, Michelle T., and Daniel Handler. And it's still one of my favorite essays because it allowed me to put those adventurous and romantic days in the 90s into a different historical frame, because not only have I changed, but the city has changed dramatically. It's not the place for underemployed artists waiting tables in the Mission as it was when I moved here. And the cafes back then were the cafes now are full of tech workers with laptops instead of people conversing over books and playing guitars at their tables as they did when I moved here. And it seemed like there was a bookstore every block back in the 90s, And so San Francisco and the Bay Area, it's still all great, and I love it. But I've become one of those, kind of nostalgic residents who prefer many things about its previous version. It was a city, I think it was much more daring, more full of ideas, and just weirder in the best of ways.
Mm-hmm.
So how about you, Brooke?
Yeah, I mean, I moved here in 2000. I was kind of on the cusp of all that. I think I missed the best part of the 90s, but it was still different. It was still edgier. There was still a lot more artists. I think we have lost a lot.
Hmm.
And I love the sentiment of that Didion quote, because I do think all cities or big metropolises, they give you some kind of rush, and especially when you're young and everything seems possible. And so when I moved here, I was like in my I guess I was 23, so I have to say early 20s. But I used to go upstairs, to a corner window of Vesuvio in the city, and I would just think and write in my journal. And all of that seems so luxurious to me now. And even if I were to do it, the things that I would think about would be so different. They would be
Hmm.
about my current work and my responsibilities. And what I was focused on back then was possibility, like who I was and what I wanted to become. And youth is a special time. And I guess that's part of why we say that youth is wasted on the young, right? Like you
Hmm.
appreciate it a lot more when you're looking back from a mature perspective. And here we circle back, Grant, to the hard earned wisdom, because I think anyone who has arrived at midlife has hard won wisdom. I mean, life throws stuff at you. And I was thinking about our recent conversation with Tom Perrotta and how we were talking about adulting being very hard. And it's beautiful and it's hard. And maybe one thing about writing and self-expression is that we find an outlet for understanding that. And it takes living in the paradox.
Yeah, that is the one thing about the wisdom of aging. It makes us keenly aware of the many paradoxes of life, and I miss the purity and the luxury, as you said, of those moments you described in Vesuvio's book. Because I actually spent many hours in that same upstairs corner window, so we might have been jockeying for the same table, and it's right across the alley from City Lights bookstore. So it's just a really wonderful place to dream and read and write. So we'll talk about aging and feminism and paradoxes and more with Sari after this short break.
Welcome back, everyone. We are so pleased to bring on Sari Botton. She is a best-selling author, editor, and teacher with decades of experience. She's the author of the memoir and essays, And You May Find Yourself, Confessions of a Late-Blooming Gen X Weirdo, chosen by Poets and Writers magazine for the 2022 edition of its annual 5 over 50 feature. For 5 years, she served as the essays editor for Long Reads. She also edited the best-selling anthologies Goodbye to All That, Writers on Loving and Leaving New York, and Never Can Say Goodbye, Writers on Their Unshakable Love for New York. She also spearheads and publishes 3 Substacks, Oldster Magazine, Memoir Monday, and Adventures in Journalism. Sari, warm welcome.
Thank you. It's so great to be here.
Well, Sari, you've long been on my radar. Of course, you published your first anthology, Goodbye to All That, with Seal Press. And I want to start with that, with our shared origins, because that anthology was, I think, your first published book. Correct me if I'm wrong.
It actually wasn't. The same year, earlier that year, I published a terribly named anthology. I co-published it. And it has a terrible cover. It's actually a good book, but it has such a bad name. I'm almost embarrassed to say it.
Now you have to.
Yeah, you have to.
Now I have to. It's called Get Out of My Crotch.
The best-selling Get Out of My Crotch. What are you talking about?
It's a co-edited project about women writing about reproductive rights. And we published it on the 40th anniversary of Roe versus Wade. And it has wonderful contributors like Roxane Gay and Katha Pollitt and so many people. But it has a terrible name and a terrible cover. And so it was a flop. But Goodbye to All That more than made up for that. And you were the acquiring editor for Goodbye to All That.
That's right. I know I was reminiscing about that. And I love that you did that previous anthology too, because I wanted to start with a question about anthologies in general. And it seems like that sets the tone or sets the stage for so much of what you do now, which is collaborating with and giving platforms to other writers. And so could you speak to being an anthology editor, especially as your starting point? And we'll get to your memoir in a little bit, but what skills and insights have you learned, from doing those early projects that carries into your work today?
That's a good question. I have learned so much editing anthologies. And really, the first one was a great teacher to me. It taught me what not to do. And so then when I came to you with Goodbye to All That, I had some better ideas of how to do it. it really taught me how to be an editor. I was a little bit of an editor and a ghostwriter before that, but it really taught me how to edit in a way in which you preserve people's voices. And you can really collaboratively edit. I pride myself on editing collaboratively with people, and also doing the least. Unless, I try to not do more than is necessary. And again, I really want to preserve writers' voices. That's something I learned as a ghostwriter. I also just really love reading anthologies, and I love creating, I like curating a bunch of voices, collecting voices around a subject, especially a subject that I have, personal experience with. I'm always thinking that everyone else is having a different experience than I am. And so I want to know that I'm not alone, which is the work of personal essay and memoir anyway. And so, when I left New York and had all these conflicted feelings about it, I wanted to know that other people felt the same way. I mean, I already was discovering that. I was living upstate, and I kept meeting other versions of myself, other writers who'd left New York for similar or different reasons. And so, and now with Oldster, I like to collect voices around the topic of aging, because I want to know, am I the only one who has a separate age in my mind from my chronological age? Am I the only one? So that's what that work is for me.
Well, Sari, your memoir is about a lot of things, but one recurring theme is trying to fit in and failing and trying to contort yourself to societal expectations and falling short. And you call yourself a late bloomer because it took you until your 50s to feel like, you'd come to terms with who you are. So I'm curious if you could speak to the role of your various identities and how they play in this collection of essays. Like I'm thinking being a Gen Xer, being a person who grew up Jewish in New York, being a feminist. It feels like all of these are all pieces of you that once you finally integrate, you see as the whole of yourself. So I was wondering, can you say more about this and how writing the book helped you see that kind of whole picture of yourself?
Yeah. When I sat down to write it, I realized it was about slightly different things than I thought it was going to be about. And I found the through line as I was revising. And I wound up leaving a lot of the pieces on the cutting room floor because it was really very much about finding myself in the wrong places because I wasn't really being myself, and then figuring out how to get to a more genuine place for myself. And I feel like I landed in so many wrong places in my life because I was trying to fit in, and I didn't fit, and I wasn't meant to fit. And so you've mentioned some pieces of my identity that I like, that I want to keep, that I'm a feminist. I'm slightly more progressive than a lot of the people I grew up with. But coming to this meant recognizing the false selves that I had tried on, and getting to a place where I could really move past them. In particular, I talk about creating an identity called Outdoorsy Sari, and she liked rugged men. And she tried to pretend she was rugged, and she nearly got regular Sari killed on numerous occasions, just doing these outdoorsy things that she wasn't equipped for or interested in, So the book is very much, it's a midlife coming of age memoir. And part of that project of coming of age is recognizing the parts of myself I invented to fit in that aren't real, that I had to admit I invented and move past. I had to admit it to myself because I didn't consciously say, I shall now invent Outdoorsy Sari, get me to camp more, where I'm going to buy a bunch of stuff I really don't want.
Well, it's so relatable, and I think I want to say, especially for women, I think that it's just something that we do, we try to blend in or fit into places that aren't right for us, and then we figure it out later. I was very curious to read in your bio on your website that an essay from this book was included in the Best American Essays, or I guess it received an honorable mention.
Yes, notable.
Notable mention. And so I was curious about that, because you're a person who accepts people's essays, and it must have been really rewarding to have gotten that nod. And that was a collection edited by Vivian Gornick. So I'm curious, is that something that you have to submit and apply to, or did they find your essay? And has there been any results, that have elevated the book because of it?
I think LitHub submitted the essay. It was an excerpt of the book that had been published on LitHub. And it means a lot to me. First of all, as someone who has, I've submitted pieces that I've edited to Best American, the whole series, for years. And one piece that I commissioned and edited by Matthew Salis's was included in an edition. And many of the essays that I've edited have received notable mention in Best American Essays, Best American Travel Writing, Best American Food Writing, Best American Sports Writing. Even though I don't know anything about sports, I have edited a couple of pieces. So it's so exciting to me to be included among the writers in the notables. And it was especially meaningful because it was Vivian Gornick who wrote one of my favorite memoirs. Fierce Attachments is it's the gold standard of memoirs. And it's also very relatable to me, as a Jewish woman. It was very, very relatable to me. And also I got to interview her once for the Rumpus. And so that she and whoever was working with her chose my essay for notable it was huge.
Well, going back to your memoir, Sari, and how you contorted yourself to fit in, and revisiting the subject of outdoorsy Sari. We can't get enough of outdoorsy Sari here, but yeah, in your introduction, though, you talk about how exposing it was to write this book, and how there were times you weren't sure you would or could, which is something I think all memoirists face at some point in their process. I know I have. So, what were the things that felt, the most confrontational about putting this work into the world?
I was worried about revealing parts of myself that people who are close to me, family, friends, that they would learn about me, that I'm as weird as I am. And also I was worried about hurting people. And that is a big subject for me. It is the subject of my column that ran on the Rumpus from about 2009 to 2018. It's still there. It's called Conversations with Writers Braver Than Me. That issue is part of what kept me from writing my memoir for so long. I had hurt people with personal essays I'd published in the past, and I knew I needed to figure out a way to tell my story and to tell it with other people in it, because stories have more than just the storyteller in them, and to do it in a way that was did the least harm. And it was very hard for me to figure it out. And I think I finally did. I first wrote the draft that no one was going to see. I call it the warts and all vomit draft. Like the draft, I had to just get it out of my body and also look at it and promise myself that no one's going to see this. And then that was really eye-opening, and it pushed me closer to the ledge. It made it a little less scary, and it helped me figure out some things. Like, there are places where, I talk about people that influenced me, like, adults who influenced me with an eating disorder. And instead of naming names, I say the adults around me. And as I was writing that, I realized, it was all the adults around me in the 70s. It was my babysitters, my school teachers, and so I found ways to not implicate people, and also blur people. I blurred one boyfriend so well that my best friend didn't recognize him. She was like, "When did you go out with a painter?" And I said, "I never went out with a painter." And she was like, "Well, who is that?" So that made me feel good. By the way, this is the subject of a great book that has just come out by Alyssa Altman called Permission. And I'm going to be having a panel at the Woodstock Book Fest about this April 6th in Woodstock, New York. And I'm also going to do a couple of events with Alyssa because I think it's such an important subject. And also, Melissa Febos has a wonderful chapter on this topic in Body Work. It's called A Big Shitty Party. I don't know if I'm allowed to say dirty words on here. Okay.
Yeah.
But this is my subject. How do you tell your story without upsetting people or hurting their reputations?
Yeah, that's so important. Wow, I'm going to check out that book and wish I could come to your panel.
Well, yeah, I hope people will go see you in Woodstock. We'll put a plug for that for sure. I was there a couple of years ago. But I'm glad you mentioned all that about Permission and all of the rest, because you're really known as a champion of memoir and personal essay. And I feel such an affinity for you for that reason. I love the work that you're doing and how you are putting it out there. And I think importantly, giving other people platform and a voice. So Grant's going to ask you about Oldster in a second, but I wanted to ask you about Memoirland. If you would just say a little bit about, what it is and what about Substack appealed to you as a place where you could do what you're doing with Memoirland.
Memoirland first came to me from Lily Danziger. It was called Memoir Monday, and it was just a Monday newsletter, and it was just essays featured by partner publications. And when I was at Longreads, I was part of it. I was one of the partner publications. The partner publications right now are LitHub, The Rumpus, Granta, Guernica, Electric Literature, The Walrus, Orion, and Oldster. And Lily came to me in 21 or 22 and said, I'm kind of over this. Do you want it? And I said, well, do you mind if I make it paid and, offer the paid feature? And also if I develop it further? She said, do whatever you want with it. And so I rebranded it as Memoirland. My wonderful friend who recently passed away, Julie Novak, made me some new logos, and I added all kinds of features. So now, first of all, Memoir Monday is no longer just the partner publications. I invite people to submit essays for me to consider for the weekly roundup, and I put a selection of them in. I also have Wednesdays, personal essays. They can either be in the first person singular section or the goodbye to all that section with New York stories. I also have something called the Memoirland Author Questionnaire now. Right now, that's running on Tuesdays and Fridays, and everyone answers the same questions similarly to the Oldster questionnaire. And so it's a really, and Thursdays, I have my writing prompts. And my writing prompts are the only thing that's paywalled right now on Memoirland. And it's really a perk for those who support my work with their dollars.
It's awesome.
Well, Sarah, I think the highlight of 2025 so far for me is doing the Oldster interview. I'm entirely serious about that. I love the questions, and I just became addicted to reading the comments. And the comments were so wonderful, and there's so many of them. And one commenter suggested that I do the interview myself every 5 years or so and see how I change. So I just might do that. But there were so many interesting suggestions and perspectives about aging in the comments. And so I was just curious, what has been the most surprising thing about editing and curating Oldster, and who's been your biggest get so far, other than me, of course?
Well, first of all, I just want to say I loved your responses, and so did the Oldster audience. Like, they were so responsive. They left great comments, and you did a great job.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. And, Oldster took right off in a way I hadn't anticipated. I had done a series on Longreads called Fine Lines that was in the same vein. And then when I left Longreads in June of 2020, I knew I wasn't done with it. I knew I had barely scratched the surface of this topic. And so in 2021, I had a dream one night. I knew I needed a new name. Longreads owns Fine Lines. I knew I needed a new name and I couldn't think of one. And then I had a dream that I started a magazine called Oldster. And I got up in the morning and I made a joke about it on Twitter. And then I said, oh, wait a second. Actually, that's kind of a good idea. And then I just started it and people just flocked to it. Like, you know, you know, Brooke, you asked earlier about Substack as a place for Memoirland. And I'll say, it's been a great place for me for all three of my newsletters. I think that Substack has a winning formula that nobody else has in the newsletter game. They blend the best of crowdfunding, social media virality, and blogging.
Yeah.
It's just, and now also video and other things. It's just, I've never been part of anything that had this much growth potential. I hope it's sustainable. Of course, whoever knows, but it's going really well and it has gone well right from the start.
It seems like it. It's exciting. I've followed both of them from early days. Like even before I knew what Substack was, I guess I was following Memoir Mondays and I'm like, what is this? So it's great to see because now I'm actually on Substack and I know what it is. Like, oh, okay, she's doing such awesome things. So anyone who does not follow Sari and all of her Substacks, but to that point, obviously writers primarily listen to this show. A lot of them are doing personal writing, of course. And right now we're living through such a hard time. I mean, chaos, fear. I'm sure you feel this and hear this too, that creative types especially are feeling so upended. And so what do you say to people who feel like they're struggling to write right now or questioning whether what they're doing even matters in light of all the things going on in the world and in our country? And maybe if you have any insight on how you've pushed through those kinds of feelings in your own work.
Funny you should ask. I wrote a piece that was published last week or the week before by Writing Collab.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we know them.
They have been doing 100 Days of Resistance. And I wrote a piece about why you should go ahead anyway and write this stuff. And I talk about how, you know, I once had this notion that you created change through storytelling in a very one directional way. That it was like I had it in my mind. You tell the stories, people hear them, they change their minds, you change the world. And, you know, I do still think that's possible, but I think there's a lot more back and forth before you get to the end. And, you know, as Rilke said, there is no final feeling. You know, we could go back and forth for the rest of our lives. But, you know, after seeing the post-Me Too backlash where, you know, what's happening in this country, what's happening with our leaders. I don't even want to say their names. You know, so many people who were credibly accused or convicted of sexual assault are running our country. I mean, this is not good. It would lead one to believe that your story about what happened to you doesn't matter or isn't going to be effective. And what I say in the piece is that the people you need to do it for are the readers who need it. You need to do it. People need your bravery and your story. You know, the people who are further down the path from you, who you need to help show that, be a beacon of light for those people who've lived through similar things, who will get from your story, A, that you survived, and B, they'll get your bravery in having the guts to tell the story, even in a climate like this. But I am also one of those writers. You know, I'm struggling. And when I was working on my book, I struggled every day to believe that my story mattered. Especially I was working on it at the beginning of COVID. I was like, people are dying. Who cares that I felt like a misfit, you know? And sometimes at 3:00 in the morning, I had to give myself permission to drop the book. I had to give why am I doing this? I should really not do this. Okay. All right. You're out. You don't have to do it. You're off the hook. And then I woke up in the morning and I was like, of course I want to do this. You know, somebody's finally giving me the chance to do this. I'm going to do it. And also, I don't know how long I'm going to live. How long can I put this off? You know, and, but I had that crisis of confidence literally every day that I was working on this, and every day until it came out.
Again, relatable. I appreciate you sharing that, because I think it helps people to hear, and people stall out, and you got to just pick yourself back up again. So thank you, Sari. So great to see you. It's been a while. So congrats on all the great things.
Thank you so much, Sari.
Thank you so much.
We'll be right back with this week's Substacking.
Well, Grant, it goes without saying that the Substack I want to feature on Substacking this week is your interview on Oldster. It is a really wonderful questionnaire, interview, whatever we want to call it, starting with a photo of you wearing a faux leopard print jacket in the middle of the desert.
Yeah, Death Valley. a tiny little cemetery in Death Valley.
I do. I love that image. And my favorite response from you was to the question, do you feel old for your age, young for your age, just right? And you said all of the above. And I think this captures what it feels like to age, this shock that exists for any of us who feel like really young one day and shockingly old the next. And so I'm curious, do you think about age or aging that much inside or outside of your writing?
Yeah, I think of age a lot these days, and I think that's part of aging, is how much more you think about it the older you get. And I think that's in part because our bodies are changing and changing kind of rapidly. So I understand why older people, often live up to the cliche of talking about their ailments so much. Your body's, it's changing in these mysterious and fascinating ways. And I think if toddlers had words for what it feels like to grow an inch in a month or lose a tooth, they'd be talking about that more as well, because that's the only other era, I think, when your body is really changing so rapidly. And then there's mortality, of course, which becomes a bigger and bigger kind of present reality. And I joke that death was peeking over the horizon when I turned 50, but now it's staring at me and walking forward. And then I can't believe it, but I have friends who are retiring. So I sit around and wonder, how can they possibly do that? Because I'm going to be working until my final day, I'm pretty sure. So there's also a part of me that wishes I would have gone into financial services.
I don't think that would have helped, actually. I think it would be much more contemplating your death if you were in financial services.
Yeah, you're right.
I totally get it, because I'm on that cusp of 50, right? I'm turning 49 this year, and I am thinking about aging much more than I used to. And I was thinking about this because when I was 39 and about to turn 40, so 10 years ago, I was really excited about turning 40. And I do not feel the same level of enthusiasm about turning 50. Neither am I dreading it. It's just a different approaching decade, and approaching 50, like you said, I'll just echo what you said, which is you see it in your face, you see it in your body in a way that you don't when you're approaching 40.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one thing about aging in general is that you kind of slam up against it, or it slams up against you. It's here, and then when there wasn't anything before, right? It's here when before there was an absence. And so in that way, I'm also thinking about it more. Grant, in the Oldster piece, there were some really good and deep questions, and I'm curious to know how easily the answers came to you, and was there a particular answer you gave that surprised you or hadn't deeply considered before?
Yeah, I think one of the things that made the interview both easy and hard at the same time is a decision that I made to be much more open and vulnerable in everything I do, whether it's my writing or talking on this show or giving interviews and speaking publicly. So I aired things like my heart problems I've been diagnosed with, and I touched on some mental health issues and some reckless living I've done, which are all part of the memoir I'm writing and keep mentioning. But I like answering the questions with vulnerability and openness. But I also had a whopping vulnerability hangover the morning it ran, because I was entirely afraid of being exposed and afraid of people's reactions and afraid that this was now on the internet forever. But one lesson of vulnerability is that it takes constant practice. But I also feel that being more vulnerable and open is a gift of aging. And to answer your question about the toughest question, I think it might have been thinking about my biggest regret. The funny thing is that our regrets are usually things that we were in control of, and they're usually things we wanted to change but somehow didn't. And When I think back on my life, I really wish I'd been more present, more grounded, as in my role as a caretaker, both for my parents and for my kids, especially. I think many people have this regret because life moves so fast. And as my wife Heather and I used to joke when our kids were small, especially, we felt like we were always in a race against time. But sometimes it's worth it to figure out how to stop that racing. So it's a lesson for now as well, to slow down and relish moments because there's still time to do so.
Yeah, that's an important one, and hard-won wisdom.
Yeah, there you go. A lot of hard-won wisdom here.
In wrapping up Substack and today, I wanted to give a word of encouragement or advice to our listeners about contributing their own writing, whether it be to an anthology or a Substack or to another form of collective writing. So how do you go about contributing to things, and what's your hard-earned wisdom for getting your work into the world, with these kinds of venues and these kinds of gatekeepers?
Yeah, I think the general rule is that you have to just ask. When I worked in fundraising as an executive director, the number one rule of fundraising is that people won't give unless you ask them to, and that really applies to all of life. So I actually reached out to Sari when I turned 60 because I admired Ulster so much and I really wanted to talk about aging. And she would have never reached out to me otherwise. So that's another lesson of aging. You've just got to ask for things.
Gosh, you're so wise.
Hard one.
I love it. And yeah, no one is going to say yes if you never ask. So we got to keep that in mind. And I'll ask the listeners as a parting wisdom, everyone, what is something that you want to contribute to or be a part of that maybe you could if you just asked, something to contemplate this week, or maybe you already know what that thing is and you just haven't asked for it yet. So make a goal and go for it. We're going to raise the stakes this week as we wrap up things today, because why not? Do something brave and bold and honoring of yourself this week or this spring, and have a very right-minded kind of week. We'll see you next time.